My name is Amelia Taylor and I am 34 years old. I've always believed that life has a soundtrack, the gentle hum of morning coffee brewing, children's laughter echoing through school hallways, the soft whisper of pages turning in a quiet library. But for the past 6 months, my world has been growing quieter, and I'm terrified that soon, it might fall completely silent. I sat in the sterile waiting room of Boston General Hospital, my fingers unconsciously tracing the outline of my hearing aid. The audiologist's words from an hour ago still echoed in my mind like a cruel joke: progressive sensory neural hearing loss. Without intervention, you'll likely be completely deaf within a year. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'm a music teacher at Riverside Elementary, and music has been my language, my passion, my entire identity for as long as I can remember. Now that very gift was being stripped away, note by note, sound by sound. Have you ever lost the one thing that made you feel alive? Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. This is how I fought through silence to find my voice again when music was ripped from my soul. Hit that like and subscribe button. Outside the hospital windows, Boston buzzed with its usual autumn energy. Leaves danced in shades of amber and crimson, and I could see people walking briskly, their mouths moving in conversations I could no longer fully hear. 6 months ago, I would have been one of them, rushing to my next piano lesson, humming a melody under my breath, completely oblivious to how precious every sound truly was. The first signs were subtle. I started asking my students to speak louder, blaming it on the old ventilation system in the music room. Then I began missing phone calls, not hearing the ring even when the device was right beside me. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, knocked on my door one evening, concerned because she'd been calling my name from across the yard for 10 minutes. "Amelia, dear, are you feeling all right?" she asked, her weathered face creased with worry. I laughed it off, claiming I'd been lost in thought, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The realization hit me fully during a school concert when I couldn't hear little Sarah Matthews singing her solo. I could see her mouth moving, see the pride on her parents' faces, but the beautiful voice I'd spent weeks helping her perfect was just gone. That night, I called my sister Rebecca in tears. "Becca, I think I'm losing my hearing." Rebecca, ever the practical one, immediately booked me an appointment with the best audiologist in Boston. As a successful architect, she approached problems with the same methodical precision she used to design buildings. But this wasn't a structural issue that could be solved with better materials or revised blueprints. The diagnosis was devastating: Meniere's disease, an inner ear disorder that was progressively destroying my hearing. The doctor explained it in clinical terms: fluid buildup, damaged hair cells, irreversible loss, but all I heard was the death knell of everything I'd built my life around. Music wasn't just my career, it was who I was. I'd been playing piano since I was 4, conducting the school choir since I was 26, and composing my own pieces in the quiet hours before dawn. How do you continue being a music teacher when you can no longer hear music? That evening, I sat at my baby grand piano, a 1920s Steinway that had belonged to my grandmother, and tried to play Debussy's Clair de Lune. My fingers found the familiar keys, but the melody that had once filled my apartment with ethereal beauty now sounded muffled and distant, as if I were hearing it through water. I closed the piano lid and cried until my chest ached. The weeks that followed were a blur of doctor's appointments, hearing tests, and increasingly desperate attempts to hold on to the sounds that were slipping away. I tried different hearing aids, explored cochlear implant options, and even looked into experimental treatments that had minimal success rates and astronomical costs. My principal, Dr. Margaret Chen, called me into her office on a gray October morning. She was kind but direct. "Amelia, I know you're going through a difficult time, but we need to discuss your future here at Riverside." I knew what was coming. How could I continue teaching music when I could barely hear my students' questions? How could I direct the holiday concert when I couldn't distinguish between instruments? "I'm placing you on medical leave," she continued gently. "Take the time you need to figure out your next steps. Your position will be here when, if things improve." The unspoken truth hung between us: things weren't going to improve. This wasn't a broken bone that would heal or an infection that would clear up with medication. This was permanent, progressive, and irreversible. I cleaned out my classroom that afternoon, packing away sheet music, lesson plans, and the small metronome that had kept time for countless student performances. As I carried the last box to my car, I felt like I was leaving behind not just a job, but my entire identity. That night, Rebecca came over with Thai takeout and a bottle of wine. We sat on my living room floor, surrounded by the detritus of my teaching career, and she held me while I grieved not just for what I was losing, but for the future I'd never have. "What am I going to do, Becca?" I whispered. "Music is all I know. It's all I've ever been good at." My sister, 5 years older and infinitely wiser, stroked my hair like she used to when we were children. "You're going to figure it out, Melia. You always do. And whatever comes next, it doesn't erase what you've already given to hundreds of kids. That matters. That's permanent." But I wasn't ready to let go. I couldn't accept that at 34 my life's work was over. So I did what any desperate person would do. I started researching miracle cures, experimental procedures, anything that might restore what I was losing. That's when I stumbled across an article about a clinical trial at Johns Hopkins University. They were testing a revolutionary procedure that combined gene therapy with advanced cochlear implant technology. The success rate was still being studied, but early results showed promise for people with progressive hearing loss like mine. There was just one catch: the trial was extremely limited, and they were only accepting patients who met very specific criteria. Age, type of hearing loss, previous medical history, everything had to align perfectly. And even if I qualified, there was a waiting list of hundreds of people, all desperate for the same chance I was seeking. I filled out the application anyway, hope and desperation warring in my chest. What did I have to lose? My hearing was disappearing regardless. At least this gave me something to fight for. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Dr. Sarah Martinez, the lead researcher on the project. "Ms. Taylor, we've reviewed your application, and you meet our preliminary criteria. However, I need to be honest with you about the odds. We have over 400 qualified applicants for just 20 spots in this trial phase." My heart sank, but Dr. Martinez continued. "There is one factor that might work in your favor. We're particularly interested in candidates whose hearing loss directly impacts their profession. Your background as a music educator makes you an ideal case study for measuring the procedure's success in restoring not just basic hearing, but the subtle auditory discrimination required for musical perception." A spark of hope ignited in my chest. What do I need to do? Come to Baltimore next week for comprehensive testing. We'll evaluate your candidacy and hopefully have an answer within 10 days. I hung up the phone and immediately called Rebecca. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. It was fragile and tentative, but it was there, hope. The trip to Johns Hopkins was surreal. Rebecca insisted on driving with me, taking time off from her busy architectural firm to sit in waiting rooms and hold my hand during the endless battery of tests. The facility was impressive: gleaming corridors, state-of-the-art equipment, and an air of quiet efficiency that spoke of serious medical innovation. Dr. Martinez was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of countless hours spent in research labs. She explained the procedure in detail. They would insert a specially designed cochlear implant and simultaneously deliver gene therapy designed to regenerate damaged hair cells in the inner ear. "It's not a guarantee," she emphasized. "And even if it works, your hearing might not return to previous levels. But for some patients, we've seen remarkable improvement, enough to return to normal daily activities and even careers that require acute hearing." The testing took 3 days. They mapped my remaining hearing, analyzed my genetic markers, and evaluated my psychological readiness for the experimental procedure. On the final day, I sat in Dr. Martinez's office, my hands clenched so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. "Amelia," she said, her voice gentle but professional, "I have good news. You've been accepted into the trial." I burst into tears right there in her office. All the fear, frustration, and grief of the past months poured out of me in great heaving sobs. Dr. Martinez handed me a box of tissues and waited patiently for me to compose myself. When? I finally managed to ask. We'd like to schedule the procedure for next month. That gives you time to arrange your affairs and prepare mentally. I won't lie to you, this is major surgery and the recovery period is significant. But if it works. She didn't need to finish the sentence. If it worked, I might get my life back. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. I arranged to stay with Rebecca during recovery, organized my finances to cover the time off work, and underwent additional medical clearances. But perhaps most importantly, I began to mentally prepare for the possibility that this might not work, that I might be pinning all my hopes on a procedure that could fail, leaving me not just deaf but also having endured major surgery for nothing. Rebecca helped me create contingency plans. We researched careers that didn't require hearing, looked into sign language classes, and explored assistive technologies that could help me navigate a silent world. It was pragmatic and necessary, but it felt like planning my own funeral. The night before the surgery, I sat at my piano one last time. I could barely hear the notes now, just vibrations through my fingertips and the faintest echo of melodies I'd known by heart for decades. I played Für Elise, the first piece I'd ever learned completely, and whispered goodbye to the instrument that had been my companion for 30 years. If this doesn't work, I said aloud to the empty apartment, I promise I'll find another way to make beautiful things. I promise I won't give up. The morning of the surgery arrived gray and cold, with the kind of November rain that chills you to the bone. Rebecca drove me to the hospital, her usually steady hands betraying her nervousness on the steering wheel. We didn't talk much, there wasn't much left to say. We'd covered all the what-ifs, all the possibilities, all the fears. Dr. Martinez met us in pre-op, her confidence reassuring even as my anxiety peaked. Remember, Amelia, regardless of the outcome, you're contributing to research that will help countless others. That's not a small thing. As they wheeled me into surgery, I closed my eyes and thought about my students, little Sarah Matthews with her sweet soprano voice, Tommy Rodriguez who struggled with rhythm but never gave up, Emma Chen who could make the violin sing like an angel. If I never heard music again, at least I'd help them find their voices. The surgery took 8 hours. I woke up in recovery with bandages covering most of my head and a peculiar sensation of complete silence. The cochlear implant wouldn't be activated for several weeks, allowing time for healing, so for now I existed in a cocoon of absolute quiet. The first few days after surgery were a blur of medications, monitoring, and medical checks. Dr. Martinez visited daily, examining the surgical site and explaining each step of the healing process. The gene therapy component of the treatment was already at work, she explained, attempting to regenerate damaged hair cells in my inner ear while the surgical site healed around the cochlear implant. The combination therapy is what makes this experimental, she told me during one of her visits. Traditional cochlear implants bypass damaged hair cells entirely, but we're hoping the gene therapy will restore some natural hearing function to work alongside the electronic signals from the device. The hospital stay stretched to 5 days due to some minor complications with my balance, a common side effect of inner ear surgery. The world felt unstable, as if I were perpetually on a boat in rough seas. Physical therapy became part of my daily routine, helping my brain recalibrate its understanding of spatial orientation without reliable inner ear input. During those hospital days, I received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor, had somehow convinced Rebecca to bring her to Baltimore. She arrived with a handmade quilt and a thermos of homemade soup, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She wrote me a note since speaking was pointless. The whole neighborhood is praying for you, dear. Your music has touched so many lives over the years. We're all waiting for you to come home and play for us again. I hadn't realized how much my casual piano playing, the melodies that drifted from my apartment windows during evening practice sessions, had meant to the people around me. Mrs. Patterson's note made me understand that my hearing loss hadn't just affected me. It had created a silence in my community that others had noticed and mourned. Another unexpected visitor was Dr. Sarah Williams, a music therapist from the hospital's pediatric ward. She'd heard about my case and wanted to discuss how music therapy techniques might aid in my rehabilitation process. Music therapy has shown remarkable results in helping cochlear implant patients adapt to their new hearing, she explained to Rebecca, since I couldn't hear her directly. The structured nature of musical exercises can help train the brain to interpret electronic signals more effectively. Dr. Williams left me with written materials about musical rehabilitation exercises and promised to coordinate with Dr. Morrison once my device was activated. Her visit gave me hope that my path back to music might be more supported than I'd initially realized. The psychological challenges of those first days were as difficult as the physical ones. Complete silence has a weight to it. It presses down on you, makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing, your heartbeat, the physical sensations that normally exist in the background of consciousness. I found myself missing sounds I'd never thought I appreciated. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of hospital activity, even the annoying beep of medical monitors. Rebecca stayed with me throughout the hospital stay, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair beside my bed and advocating with nurses and doctors when I couldn't communicate my needs effectively. She developed an elaborate system of hand signals and written notes to help me navigate basic needs and emotions. One evening, as I watched the sun set through the hospital window, painting the Baltimore skyline in shades of orange and pink, I tried to imagine what sounds might be accompanying the visual beauty I could see. Were birds settling into their evening roosts? Was traffic humming on the distant highways? Were people walking home from work, their conversations mixing with the urban symphony I could no longer hear? Rebecca noticed me staring out the window and wrote me a note. "What are you thinking about?" I wrote back, "I'm trying to remember what silence used to sound like." Before, silence was the space between sounds. Now silence is everything. I'm not sure which is worse, the silence or not knowing if it will ever end. She squeezed my hand and wrote, "It will end. Dr. Martinez says your surgery went perfectly. In a few weeks we'll know if this worked." The night before my discharge, I had a vivid dream that I was conducting a full orchestra. I could hear every instrument distinctly, the soaring violins, the deep resonance of the cellos, the bright punctuation of the brass section. In the dream, the music was more beautiful than anything I'd ever heard in real life, layer upon layer of harmonies building to a crescendo that made my heart race. I woke with tears on my cheeks, unsure whether the dream was a memory of sounds I'd lost or a preview of sounds I might regain. The boundary between hope and fantasy had become increasingly blurred during my time in the hospital. Rebecca was there when I opened my eyes, her face a mixture of relief and worry. She mouthed words I couldn't hear, then wrote on a small whiteboard, "How do you feel?" I considered the question. Physically, I was in pain, my head throbbed, and my balance was completely off. But emotionally? I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, peace. I'd done everything I could. The outcome was no longer in my hands. Recovery was challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. The complete silence was disorienting. I couldn't hear my own footsteps, my own breathing, the rumble of traffic outside Rebecca's apartment windows. Simple tasks became complicated when you couldn't hear approaching cars or someone calling your name. The adjustment to living in Rebecca's apartment during recovery presented its own challenges. She'd done her best to make the space accommodating, installing visual alerts for the doorbell and phone, ensuring I had clear sight lines to see people approaching, and rearranging furniture to minimize obstacles that might cause balance-related falls. But the simple act of making coffee became an exercise in adaptation. Without being able to hear the coffee maker's signals, the initial gurgle of water heating, the steady drip of brewing, the final sputtering that indicated the cycle was complete, I had to rely entirely on visual cues and timing. More than once, I forgot about the coffee and discovered it hours later, cold and bitter. Rebecca worked from home during my first 2 weeks of recovery, determined not to leave me alone while my balance issues persisted. I felt guilty about disrupting her architectural practice, but she dismissed my concerns with characteristic directness. "My projects can wait," she wrote me one morning when I'd expressed my feelings. "Buildings will still need designing next month. Right now you need me, and that's more important than any blueprint." Her devotion reminded me of how Daniel had cared for Emily in the story I'd read months earlier, and I found myself wondering if I was as gracious a patient as Daniel had been. The complete dependence on another person for basic safety and communication was humbling in ways I hadn't expected. Physical therapy sessions 3 times a week helped gradually restore my balance, but progress was slow and sometimes frustrating. The therapist, a patient woman named Jennifer, worked with me on exercises designed to help my brain recalibrate its understanding of spatial relationships without reliable vestibular input from my inner ear. "Your brain is incredibly adaptable," she assured me during one particularly difficult session where I'd fallen twice while attempting to walk a straight line with my eyes closed. "It's learning to rely more heavily on visual and proprioceptive cues to maintain balance. This is all normal." Normal or not, the experience was exhausting. By the end of each day, I felt drained not just from the physical challenges but from the mental effort required to navigate a world where one of my primary senses had been completely eliminated. But Rebecca was patient, creating systems to help me navigate this temporary soundless world. She installed flashing lights connected to the doorbell, used a vibrating alarm clock to wake me, and learned basic sign language so we could communicate more effectively. 3 weeks after surgery, the day arrived for my first device activation. I was terrified and excited in equal measure. Dr. Martinez had warned me that the initial sounds would be strange, not at all like normal hearing, and that it would take time for my brain to learn how to interpret the electrical signals from the implant. I sat in a soundproof booth, Rebecca beside me, as the audiologist slowly activated the device. The first sensation wasn't really sound at all, it was more like electrical buzzing in my head. But gradually, as they adjusted the settings, I began to distinguish different types of signals. "Can you hear this?" the audiologist asked, her voice sounding robotic and distorted through the device. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. It wasn't music, it wasn't even close to normal hearing, but it was something. For the first time in months, I wasn't living in complete silence. The next few weeks were a journey of small victories and frustrating setbacks. My brain had to relearn how to process sound, and everything was strange and mechanical at first. Water running from a faucet sounded like static, birds chirping sounded like electronic beeps, and human voices were almost unintelligible. The rehabilitation process was more complex than I'd imagined. Dr. Martinez had arranged for me to work with a specialized audiologist, Dr. James Morrison, who had years of experience helping cochlear implant patients adapt to their new hearing. His office became my second home as I attended sessions 3 times a week. "Your brain is essentially learning a new language," Dr. Morrison explained during one of our early sessions. "The electrical signals from the implant are different from natural sound waves. We need to train your auditory cortex to interpret these signals as meaningful sound." The exercises were exhausting. Hours of listening to single tones, trying to distinguish between similar sounds, practicing with recorded speech at different speeds and volumes. Some days I felt like I was making tremendous progress, others I wondered if I'd ever hear normally again. Rebecca attended several sessions with me, learning how to help with my at-home practice. She read lists of words while I tried to identify them with my eyes closed, played recorded music at low volumes while I attempted to identify instruments, and patiently repeated conversations when the implant's processing made speech unclear. One of the most challenging aspects was dealing with background noise. In the real world, sounds don't come in isolated, controlled environments like Dr. Morrison's office. The implant picked up everything: air conditioning, traffic, conversations at neighboring tables in restaurants, and my brain hadn't yet learned to filter out the irrelevant noise and focus on what I wanted to hear. I remember trying to have lunch with Rebecca at our favorite cafe, a place we'd been going for years. The familiar environment felt alien and overwhelming. The espresso machine hissed like a snake, plates clattering sounded like crashes, and the gentle murmur of conversation became an incomprehensible wall of electronic noise. "I can't do this," I whispered to Rebecca, my eyes filling with tears. "It's too much. Everything sounds wrong." Rebecca reached across the table and took my hand. "It's okay, Melia. This is all part of the process. Remember what Dr. Morrison said, your brain needs time to adapt. 6 months ago you couldn't hear anything at all. She was right, but knowing that intellectually didn't make the daily struggles any easier. I found myself exhausted by the end of each day, drained by the constant effort of trying to make sense of the strange new soundscape around me. Simple activities that had once been automatic now required intense concentration. Sleep became difficult too. The implant had to be removed at night, plunging me back into the silence I'd worked so hard to escape. The transition between the electronic hearing during the day and complete quiet at night was jarring, like constantly switching between two different worlds. But there were breakthrough moments that kept me going. 3 weeks into rehabilitation, I was walking through Rebecca's neighborhood when I heard a dog barking. Not the electronic beeping that dogs had sounded like initially, but actual barking, sharp, insistent, recognizably canine. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and laughed out loud, causing a passerby to look at me strangely. Another breakthrough came during a session with Dr. Morrison when he played a recording of children singing, "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." Suddenly, inexplicably, the melody clicked into place. The electronic signals my brain had been struggling to interpret suddenly coalesced into something unmistakably musical. I burst into tears right there in his office, overwhelmed by the simple beauty of a children's song. "That's it," Dr. Morrison said with satisfaction. "That's your brain making the connections it needs to make. From here, things should start improving more rapidly." He was right. Over the following weeks, sounds became increasingly natural. Voices lost their robotic quality, environmental sounds became more recognizable, and gradually, beautifully, music began to return to my world. But slowly, miraculously, things began to improve. The gene therapy component of the treatment was working in conjunction with the implant, and my audiologist was amazed by my progress. Sounds became clearer, more natural, more recognizable. 6 weeks post-surgery, I had my first major breakthrough. Rebecca was making coffee in her kitchen when I called out, "Becca, that smells amazing." She turned to look at me, her eyes wide. "You heard the coffee maker?" I nodded, suddenly realizing what had happened. I'd heard the familiar gurgling sound of the machine and associated it with the smell of brewing coffee, something I'd done automatically thousands of times before. My brain was beginning to make those connections again. 2 months after surgery, Dr. Martinez declared my case a remarkable success. My hearing, while not perfect, had returned to about 70% of normal levels. More importantly, I was beginning to distinguish musical tones again, the very thing that had seemed most impossible. She scheduled one final test, something she called musical discrimination assessment. In a small room filled with various instruments, she played different notes, chords, and melodies, asking me to identify what I heard. When she played a simple C major scale on the piano, I burst into tears. It wasn't perfect, some notes were clearer than others, but it was music. Real, beautiful, unmistakable music. "I think," Dr. Martinez said with a smile, "you're ready to go home." Returning to my apartment after 3 months felt like visiting a foreign country. Everything looked the same, but my relationship with the space had fundamentally changed. I approached my piano with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. I sat down and placed my fingers on the keys, took a deep breath, and played a single note, middle C. The sound that emerged wasn't exactly as I remembered it, but it was rich, full, and beautiful in a way that made my heart race. Slowly, carefully, I began to play Clair de Lune again. Some notes were clearer than others, and I had to concentrate harder than before to hear the subtle harmonies, but the melody was there. The music was there. I called Rebecca immediately. "I can hear Debussy," I sobbed into the phone. "I can hear the piano. I can hear music again." The next step was determining whether I could return to teaching. Dr. Chen arranged for me to visit Riverside Elementary as an observer first, to see how I functioned in a classroom environment with my new hearing. Walking back into the music room after 4 months away was emotional in ways I hadn't expected. The space looked exactly the same, my piano, the rows of chairs, the bulletin board still decorated with musical notes and encouraging messages. But I was different now, forever changed by my journey through silence and back. The children were in the middle of choir practice when I entered. Mrs. Henderson, my temporary replacement, was leading them through "This Land Is Your Land," and the sound of 20 young voices raised in song was overwhelming in the most beautiful way. Little Sarah Matthews spotted me first and waved excitedly. I could hear her whisper to her friend, "Miss Taylor is back." The whisper was clear, distinct, audible, a small miracle that made me want to laugh and cry simultaneously. After class, several of my former students gathered around me, chattering about what they'd been learning, which songs they'd missed me teach, and when I was coming back. Their voices were a symphony of different pitches and tones, and I could distinguish each one. Tommy Rodriguez, now a year older and more confident, asked, "Miss Taylor, can you hear us okay now?" I knelt down to his level and smiled. "Yes, Tommy. I can hear you perfectly." Dr. Chen offered me a gradual return to work, first as an assistant, then slowly taking on more responsibilities as I adjusted to teaching with my new hearing. The cochlear implant processed some sounds differently than normal hearing, and I had to learn to work with these changes rather than against them. Music, I discovered, sounded slightly different now. Some instruments were clearer than others, and I had to train myself to recognize tonal qualities that my brain now interpreted through electronic signals. But in many ways, this made me a better teacher. I had to focus more intently on every sound, to really listen in a way I'd perhaps taken for granted before. My experience also gave me a unique perspective on students with hearing difficulties. I advocated for better accommodations, learned more about assistive listening devices, and became a resource for families dealing with hearing loss. 6 months after returning to work, I was selected to present at a national music education conference about adaptive teaching techniques. Standing in front of 300 music educators, sharing my story and the insights I'd gained, felt like completing a circle. Hearing loss forced me to discover that music isn't just about sound, I told the audience. It's about vibration, emotion, connection, and the universal human need to create something beautiful together. My journey through silence taught me that music exists even when we can't hear it, in the way a student's face lights up when they finally master a difficult passage, in the rhythm of fingers finding the right keys, in the shared joy of creation. The standing ovation was something I felt as much as heard, hundreds of people moved by a story of loss, hope, and renewal. 1 year after my surgery, I received a letter from Dr. Martinez. The clinical trial had been deemed successful enough to move to the next phase, and my case was being used as a model for expanding the program. More people like me would have the chance to reclaim their hearing and their lives. But the letter contained more than just scientific updates. Dr. Martinez had included information about a young man named David Chen, a 26-year-old violinist from San Francisco who had lost his hearing in a car accident 6 months earlier. His case was similar to mine, a musician whose entire identity was tied to his ability to hear and create music. The experimental procedure that had saved my hearing was now his only hope. "I'm writing to ask if you'd consider mentoring David through his journey," Dr. Martinez's letter continued. "Your unique perspective as a musician who has navigated this exact experience could provide invaluable support during his recovery process." I sat with the letter for several days, considering the request. The idea of helping someone else navigate the terrifying journey I just completed was both appealing and daunting. Could I really guide another person through the darkness I'd barely escaped myself? Rebecca encouraged me to reach out to David. "Think about how much difference it would have made if you'd had someone to talk to who really understood what you were going through," she said. "Someone who could tell you that it was possible to come out the other side." I finally called David on a rainy Thursday evening in November. His voice, when he answered, carried the same defeated quality mine had possessed a year earlier. We talked for over 2 hours that first conversation, and I could hear myself in his fears, his anger, his desperate hope that the procedure might work. "The silence is the worst part," he told me. "I keep reaching for my violin, then remembering that there's no point. I can't hear if I'm playing in tune, can't feel the music the way I used to. I feel like I've lost myself." "I know," I said, and meant it completely. I sat at my piano for months, unable to play, feeling like the person I'd always been had just disappeared. But David, I'm sitting at that same piano right now and I can hear every note. It's different than it was before, but it's still music. It's still beautiful. Over the following months, David and I developed a friendship built on shared experience and mutual understanding. I attended his surgery just as Rebecca had attended mine and sat in the waiting room while Dr. Martinez worked to give him back his hearing. His recovery was different from mine. Every patient's journey is unique, but the core challenges were the same. The disorientation, the mechanical sounds, the slow process of teaching his brain to interpret electrical signals as music. I shared strategies that had worked for me, warned him about setbacks I'd experienced, and mostly just listened when he needed someone who truly understood. 6 months after David's surgery, he sent me a recording. It was him playing a simple melody on his violin, Pachelbel's Canon in D. The sound quality wasn't perfect, it was clearly recorded on a phone in a small apartment. But the music was there, real and beautiful and unmistakably the work of someone who had found his way back to his art. "I couldn't have done this without you," he wrote in the accompanying message. "Knowing that someone else had walked this path and made it through gave me hope when I had none." Our correspondence led to something unexpected. Dr. Martinez asked if I'd be interested in helping develop a peer support program for future clinical trial participants. The idea was to pair newly diagnosed patients with people who had successfully completed the procedure, creating a network of understanding and encouragement. The program launched 6 months later, and I found myself training other mentors, developing support materials, and speaking at medical conferences about the psychological aspects of experimental hearing restoration. What had started as my personal journey through hearing loss had evolved into a mission to help others find their way back to the sounds they'd lost. Meanwhile, my teaching career continued to flourish in ways I'd never expected. The experience of losing and regaining my hearing had made me more attuned to the needs of students with various learning differences. I began advocating for better accommodations for hearing-impaired students, learning sign language to communicate with deaf and hard-of-hearing children, and developing teaching techniques that incorporated visual and tactile elements alongside auditory instruction. One particularly memorable student was 8-year-old Maria Santos, who had been born with partial hearing loss. Traditional music instruction had been challenging for her, but using techniques I developed during my own rehabilitation, we found ways to help her experience music through vibration, visual cues, and modified instruments. Watching Maria perform in the spring concert, her face radiant with joy as she played a simplified version of Für Elise on the piano, reminded me why I'd fought so hard to return to teaching. Music wasn't just about perfect pitch or flawless technique. It was about the human need to create, to express, to connect with something larger than ourselves. The peer support program grew beyond my wildest expectations. Within 2 years, we had mentors across the country, supporting not just clinical trial participants but anyone dealing with sudden hearing loss. The network became a lifeline for people facing the same terror and isolation I'd experienced, proving that healing happens not just through medical intervention, but through human connection and shared understanding. Dr. Martinez often told me that my case had been pivotal in securing funding for expanded research. The success of the initial trial led to larger studies, improved surgical techniques, and eventually, the procedure became available to patients outside of experimental protocols. What had started as a desperate last resort had evolved into a standard treatment option for people with progressive hearing loss. 5 years after my surgery, I was invited to speak at the annual conference of the American Academy of Audiology. Standing before an audience of hearing professionals, sharing my story and the lessons learned through the peer support program, felt like the completion of a journey that had begun in despair and led to purpose. Hearing loss strips away more than just sound, I told the audience. It can steal identity, confidence, and connection. But restoration, whether through medical intervention, assistive technology, or adaptive strategies, gives back more than the ability to hear. It returns hope, purpose, and the knowledge that we are more resilient than we ever imagined. The speech was later published in several medical journals, and I began receiving invitations to speak at universities, hospitals, and support groups across the country. Each speaking engagement reinforced my belief that sharing our stories, our struggles, and our triumphs creates pathways for others to find their own way through darkness. My involvement in the medical community led to unexpected opportunities. Dr. Martinez invited me to join the advisory board for the expanded clinical trial program, giving patient advocates a voice in research design and implementation. The role required me to review research protocols, interview potential participants, and help develop more comprehensive support systems for trial participants. Medical research has traditionally been conducted by doctors and scientists, Dr. Martinez explained during my first board meeting. But we're learning that patient perspective is crucial for developing treatments that actually improve lives, not just address symptoms. The advisory position introduced me to other patient advocates from various medical conditions, cancer survivors, people with chronic pain conditions, individuals dealing with neurological disorders. Each had a story of medical crisis that had transformed them from passive patients into active voices for change. One board member, Dr. Michael Torres, was a former emergency room physician who had developed early-onset Parkinson's disease. His perspective on the patient experience had revolutionized how his hospital approached neurological care. "Illness changes you," he told me during a coffee break at one of our meetings. "It can make you bitter and withdrawn, or it can teach you empathy and purpose. The choice is ours, but making the right choice requires support and opportunity." His words resonated deeply with my own journey. The hearing loss that had initially seemed like an ending had become a beginning, not just of restored hearing, but of a new understanding of my role in the world. The advisory work led to my involvement in a documentary about experimental medical treatments. The filmmaker, Jessica Chong, had heard about my story through the peer support program and wanted to explore how patients navigate the decision to participate in clinical trials. Filming took place over several months, following not just my story but those of other trial participants dealing with different conditions. The process was emotionally challenging, reliving the fear and uncertainty of my diagnosis, the desperate hope of seeking experimental treatment, and the gradual journey back to normalcy. But it was also healing. Seeing my experience reflected alongside others helped me understand that my journey was part of a larger human story about resilience, hope, and the courage to fight for a better future even when the odds seem impossible. The documentary, titled Experimental Hope, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and later aired on PBS. The response was overwhelming, hundreds of emails from people dealing with their own medical challenges, thanking me for sharing my story and asking for advice about their own difficult decisions. One letter particularly moved me. It came from a 16-year-old girl named Sophie Martinez, no relation to Dr. Martinez, who had been born with a rare genetic condition that was gradually destroying her vision. She was considering an experimental gene therapy trial similar to mine. "I'm scared," she wrote. "But watching your documentary made me realize that being scared isn't a reason not to try. You show that sometimes the scariest decisions lead to the most beautiful outcomes." I called Sophie and her family, sharing my experience and helping them navigate the complex process of clinical trial participation. 6 months later, I received a photo of Sophie at her high school graduation. The experimental treatment had successfully halted the progression of her vision loss, allowing her to maintain enough sight to pursue her dream of becoming a teacher. These connections with David, Sophie, and countless others through the peer support program became the most meaningful part of my post-surgery life. Each person I helped reminded me that my experience had value beyond my own recovery. My teaching career also evolved in unexpected directions. The school district asked me to develop a curriculum for training teachers to work with hearing-impaired students. The program I created incorporated not just technical knowledge about hearing loss and assistive devices, but also the emotional and social aspects of navigating the world with impaired hearing. Training sessions often included personal testimonials from students and families dealing with hearing loss, as well as hands-on experience with assistive technologies. Teachers learned to use visual cues, modify their communication styles, and create inclusive classroom environments where all students could participate fully in musical activities. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work was seeing how it changed teachers' perspectives on accessibility and inclusion. Many began implementing universal design principles that benefited not just hearing-impaired students but all learners, using visual aids to supplement auditory instruction, providing written summaries of spoken content, and creating multiple pathways for students to engage with musical concepts. The program grew beyond our district, eventually being adopted by school systems across Massachusetts and then nationally. What had started as my personal journey through hearing loss had evolved into a systemic change in how music education approached accessibility. 5 years after my surgery, Rebecca surprised me with tickets to the Boston Symphony Orchestra's season opening performance. It was my first time attending a professional concert since regaining my hearing, and I was nervous about how the experience might compare to my memories of pre-hearing loss concerts. We sat in the middle section, close enough to see the musicians' expressions but far enough back to experience the full acoustic blend of the orchestra. As the conductor raised his baton and the first notes of Beethoven's Symphony No. 9 filled the hall, I was overwhelmed not just by the beauty of the music, but by the realization of how far I'd come. The sound wasn't exactly as I remembered it. The cochlear implant processed some frequencies differently than natural hearing, but it was unmistakably, gloriously music. The interplay of instruments, the dynamic swells and gentle diminuendos, the way individual melodic lines wove together into a complex harmonic tapestry, it was all there, available to me again. During the Ode to Joy movement, as the chorus joined the orchestra in Schiller's celebration of universal brotherhood, I found myself crying. Not from sadness or loss, but from gratitude so profound it felt almost overwhelming. The music that had defined my identity, that I'd thought I'd lost forever, was flooding back into my consciousness with all its beauty intact. Rebecca noticed my tears and reached over to squeeze my hand. Later, she told me that watching my face during that concert was one of the most moving experiences of her life. "You looked like someone discovering music for the first time," she said. "The wonder, the joy, the complete absorption, it reminded me why music matters so much to you." The concert experience inspired me to begin composing again, something I hadn't attempted since before my hearing loss. The pieces I created were different from my earlier work, more complex harmonically, perhaps influenced by my deeper appreciation for the intricacies of sound and silence. My first major composition after the surgery was a piece for piano and electronic instruments, exploring the relationship between natural and artificial sound. I called it Between Frequencies, reflecting my experience of existing between the world of natural hearing and the electronic interpretation provided by my cochlear implant. The piece premiered at a concert featuring compositions by local musicians, performed by students from the New England Conservatory. Hearing my music performed by talented young musicians was emotional in ways I hadn't expected. It represented not just my return to composition, but my reconnection with the broader musical community. After the concert, several conservatory students approached me to discuss my experience with hearing loss and recovery. Many were worried about their own hearing health, having read about musicians who had developed tinnitus or noise-induced hearing loss from prolonged exposure to loud music. These conversations led to my involvement in developing hearing conservation programs for music students. Working with audiologists and music educators, we created curricula that taught young musicians about protecting their hearing while pursuing their artistic goals, using proper ear protection during loud rehearsals, taking breaks to prevent acoustic overexposure, and recognizing early signs of hearing damage. The program included my personal story as a case study, demonstrating both the devastating impact of hearing loss on a musician's life and the potential for recovery through medical intervention. Students learned that while hearing loss doesn't have to end a musical career, prevention is always preferable to treatment. My work in hearing conservation brought me into contact with professional musicians dealing with their own hearing challenges. I met a violinist from the Boston Symphony who had developed tinnitus, a jazz pianist struggling with age-related hearing loss, and a rock guitarist who had damaged his hearing during years of loud performances. Each had a different story, but common themes emerged: the fear of losing musical ability, the challenge of continuing to perform with compromised hearing, and the need for support from others who understood the unique challenges facing musicians with hearing impairment. We formed an informal support group that met monthly, sharing strategies for managing hearing loss while maintaining musical careers. The group grew to include not just performers but also music teachers, audio engineers, and other music industry professionals dealing with hearing-related challenges. These connections reinforced my understanding that my journey through hearing loss and recovery was part of a larger story affecting countless people in the music community. My experience had given me a platform to advocate for better hearing health awareness and support systems for musicians at all levels. As I approached the 10-year anniversary of my initial diagnosis, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by the experience of losing and regaining my hearing. What had started as a terrifying medical crisis had evolved into a calling that touched many aspects of my life: teaching, advocacy, research, composition, and community building. The teenage girl who had started taking piano lessons 30 years earlier could never have imagined this path. Neither could the confident young teacher who had thought her biggest challenge would be helping students master difficult musical concepts. Life had a way of taking unexpected turns, revealing strengths and purposes you never knew you possessed. That evening, I sat at my piano and played a piece I'd been working on, an original composition inspired by my journey. I called it "The Sound of Silence," not because it was about the absence of sound, but because it was about discovering the music that exists in the spaces between notes, the beauty that emerges from struggle, and the profound gift of being able to hear the world sing again. As I played the final chord and listened to it resonate through my apartment, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. 6 months of progressive hearing loss had felt like watching the world fade away. The surgery and recovery had been a leap of faith into the unknown. But sitting there, surrounded by music once again, I realized that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what truly matters. My hearing wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was enough to teach, enough to create, enough to connect with the students who depended on me to help them find their own voices. And in a world that often feels too loud, too chaotic, too overwhelming, perhaps the lesson I'd learned was the most important of all. Every sound is a gift, every note is a miracle, and the ability to share music with others is one of the most profound privileges life can offer. Rebecca visited that weekend, bringing Chinese takeout and a bottle of champagne to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of my surgery. As we sat on my living room floor, just as we had during my darkest days, she raised her glass in a toast. "To second chances," she said. I clinked my glass against hers, hearing the clear, sweet chime of crystal meeting crystal. "To second chances," I agreed, "and to never taking the music for granted again." Outside my window, Boston hummed with its evening symphony: car horns, footsteps, laughter, conversation. It was a beautiful cacophony that I'd learned not to hear, then fought to hear again, and now treasured with every fiber of my being. I was Amelia Taylor, 35 years old, music teacher, survivor, and living proof that sometimes the most beautiful songs emerge from the deepest silence. And as I sat there with my sister, listening to the world sing, I knew that my story was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning.